The sun was merciless in the heart of the Mojave Desert, painting the endless dunes in golden waves that shimmered under the heat. Jack Carter pulled his wide-brimmed hat lower, wiping sweat off his brow. He had wandered this wilderness for years, finding solace in its isolation after leaving behind a chaotic world. The desert to him was a place of clarity and simplicity. But today, simplicity was far from what he would find. He first spotted it while scanning the horizon with his binoculars, a column of smoke rising against the otherwise clear sky. It wasn't the usual black plume of an off-road vehicle accident or a campfire. This smoke was thin, silvery, and somehow unnatural. His curiosity piqued. Jack slung his canteen over his shoulder and started toward the source, boots crunching over cracked earth. The closer he got, the stranger the scene became. Pieces of metal, charred and twisted, were scattered across the sands. Some parts glimmered like molten silver, far too advanced to belong to any human aircraft Jack had ever seen. The center of the wreckage was a crater, still radiating heat. Jack paused, his instincts urging caution. He had seen things in his years as an adventurer: abandoned mines, strange relics, even a few experimental drones tested far from public eyes. But this felt different. And then he saw her. At the edge of the crater stood a figure, swaying slightly as if on the verge of collapse. At first, Jack thought it was a trick of the light. The desert played cruel games with mirages, and dehydration could make even the most rational mind see phantoms. But as he stepped closer, he realized she was real, very real. The figure was tall, her skin a faintly glowing shade of pearl white, her hair shimmering like strands of silver. Her clothing, or what remained of it, was a patchwork of translucent fabric barely clinging to her form, as though it had been burned away in the crash. Yet, despite her alien appearance, there was something undeniably human about her. "Hey," Jack called, keeping his tone steady but non-threatening. "Are you okay?" The woman, if that's what she was, turned toward him. Her large violet eyes blinked slowly, as though trying to process what she was seeing. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, she staggered forward, her legs giving way beneath her. Jack caught her just before she hit the ground. Up close, he could see faint patterns etched into her skin, like delicate circuitry. Her breathing was shallow, and her body temperature was strangely cool, even in the desert heat. She wasn't human, that much was clear. But she was alive, and clearly in distress. "All right, easy now," Jack muttered, more to himself than to her. He gently laid her down on a patch of relatively cool sand, reaching for his canteen. "Let's get you some water." He unscrewed the cap and tilted the canteen toward her lips. For a moment, she hesitated, her eyes locking onto his with a mixture of fear and confusion. Then, slowly, she allowed him to pour the water into her mouth. She coughed at first, but soon drank greedily, her trembling fingers brushing against his hand. "Okay, that's better," Jack said, trying to ignore the growing unease in his chest. "Can you understand me? Can you talk?" She didn't answer, but her gaze darted to the wreckage behind them. With surprising speed, she grabbed a stick from the ground and began drawing in the sand. Jack watched, his curiosity outweighing his apprehension. The first symbol she drew was a star, a simple 5-pointed shape. Then she added smaller stars around it, connecting them with lines. It was a constellation, one Jack didn't recognize. "Is that where you're from?" he asked, kneeling beside her. She nodded, her movements slow but deliberate. Then she drew a shape that looked like a ship, followed by an explosion. Finally, she pointed to herself, and then to the sky, her expression filled with desperation. Jack leaned back, processing what he'd just seen. "You crashed here," he said. "You're stranded." Another nod. Jack exhaled, running a hand through his sun-bleached hair. He had no idea what to do next. This wasn't just another hiker lost in the desert, or some secret government project gone awry. This was an extraterrestrial, a being from beyond the stars, relying on him for survival. "All right," he said finally, standing up and offering her a hand. "Let's get you to some shade. We'll figure this out." She hesitated before taking his hand, her touch light as a feather. Together, they made their way toward his outpost, the desert stretching endlessly around them. Jack glanced at the sky, where faint trails of light seemed to dance on the horizon. Something told him this was just the beginning. Jack spent the rest of the afternoon tending to the alien princess, as he had come to think of her. She was silent, her strange eyes constantly darting around, as though she were listening for something. It wasn't until nightfall that Jack realized something was off. She wasn't just recovering from the crash. She was waiting. He led her to a small shelter he built years ago, a modest building with walls made from scrap metal and wood, designed to withstand the desert's harsh winds. The princess seemed uneasy, but allowed Jack to guide her inside. She sat on a cot Jack had prepared, looking at the stars through the narrow window. Jack, feeling the weight of the situation pressing on him, made his way to the corner of the room and began rummaging through some old tools. He needed to get his radio working again. Something about the princess's silent urgency made him feel the need to call for help. But every time he looked over at her, she was staring out at the sky, almost hypnotically. He turned on the radio, adjusting the dials. Static crackled, filling the small room with noise. Jack cursed under his breath. This thing hadn't worked in months. He was about to give up when a strange sound broke through the static. A series of beeps and clicks, like a message encoded in some language he didn't recognize. His heart skipped a beat. Before he could respond, he noticed the princess's eyes had locked onto the radio, and she was now standing, her body stiff. She made a soft, almost imperceptible gesture with her hands, as though telling him to be quiet. Jack froze. For a moment, everything was still. The princess's head tilted slightly to one side, her violet eyes narrowing. Jack leaned forward, his hand hovering over the radio. Then, with a sense of urgency, the princess pointed toward the window, her gaze fixed on the stars above. "Is there something out there?" Jack whispered, not expecting an answer. The princess didn't respond, but the tension in her posture spoke volumes. She was focused on something in the sky. Jack's instincts told him to trust her, so he stood up and moved toward the window, pulling back the curtain slightly. At first, he saw nothing, just the same vast expanse of dark sky, dotted with distant stars. But then, just as he was about to turn away, something shifted, a faint light, flickering like a star at the edge of the horizon. It wasn't like any plane or satellite he had ever seen. It moved too quickly, erratically, almost as if it were deliberately avoiding detection. "Is that them?" Jack muttered, more to himself than to her. The princess's sharp intake of breath confirmed his suspicion. She was now standing beside him, her face tense, her eyes locked onto the light. "Who are they?" Jack asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer, but her hand moved to her chest, where her strange, glowing markings pulsed in a slow rhythm. Jack could feel the weight of her gaze on him. Whatever was coming, it was connected to her, and it wasn't friendly. Without warning, the radio crackled again. This time, the message was clearer, though still indecipherable. The beeps were organized, like a pattern or a code. Jack quickly grabbed a pencil and paper, jotting down the sequence. Maybe he could figure it out later, but right now, he needed to focus on the immediate threat. The lights in the sky grew brighter, and Jack's heart started racing. The princess's anxiety seemed to be growing too. She stepped back from the window and began to draw it in the sand on the floor, much like she had earlier. This time, her symbols were more intricate, more frantic. She drew a map, or at least that's what Jack assumed it was. She traced a path with sharp, urgent strokes, starting from where they were now and moving toward a point in the sky, indicating the location of the approaching ships. Jack's blood ran cold as he understood what she was trying to say. "They're coming for you," Jack said, a chill settling in his bones. She nodded, her face filled with both fear and resignation. The message was clear. The alien warship wasn't just looking for a lost princess. It was hunting her down, and by extension, anyone who got in its way. Jack didn't know what to do. He wasn't equipped to fight off an alien warship, and even if he was, there was no way he could hide from something that advanced. But there was one thing he did know. He wasn't going to abandon her. As the faint lights in the sky grew closer, Jack's mind raced. There had to be a way to buy some time, to prepare for what was coming. He needed to move fast. "I won't leave you," Jack said quietly, his voice filled with determination. The princess's eyes softened for a moment, as though she was surprised by his words. Then she turned back to the window, her expression hardening once again. The sky above them was no longer silent. The sound of something large approaching could be faintly heard in the distance, and Jack's heart sank as he realized just how much danger they were in. But no matter what happened next, Jack knew one thing for sure. He would face it with her. The sound of the distant alien craft was growing louder, a deep rumble that vibrated the air itself. Jack stood by the window, staring at the night sky, his heart pounding. The princess, standing beside him, didn't need to speak for him to understand. The warship was coming for her, and soon. Jack knew he had no time to waste. The princess had shown him the stars, the path the ship would take, but he had no plan. His mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. They were in the desert, a place that offered no cover, no escape. If the warship wanted her, it would find them easily. He turned to face her. "We need help," he muttered, more to himself than to her. She looked back at him, her face a mask of worry. Jack wasn't sure if she understood every word, but it was clear she grasped the gravity of the situation. The room was small, and the silence felt thick, as though the walls were closing in. Jack felt the weight of the decision pressing on him. He couldn't fight an alien warship. He wasn't trained for something like that. But he had one thing on his side: his knowledge of Earth and its people. "I'll call for backup," Jack decided, his voice firm. "It's the only chance we've got." The princess nodded silently, her hands clenched at her sides. Jack could feel the fear radiating from her. He understood it. She was a stranger on Earth, a world she didn't know, with an enemy closing in from the stars. He turned and grabbed his old satellite phone, checking the battery. It was almost dead, but there was just enough power for one call. His fingers hovered over the buttons. Who could he trust with this? The military. They had resources, but Jack wasn't sure they'd listen. Or worse, they might try to take the princess for themselves. After all, an alien was a valuable asset in the right hands. His heart sank as he thought about the choices ahead. He couldn't let that happen. No matter what, he had to protect her. Jack knew that, despite the risks, he had to choose the right course. He had to stand for humanity's better side. Its compassion and honor, not greed. With a deep breath, he dialed the number of an old friend, Captain Elaine Turner. She was someone he trusted, someone who had always acted with integrity. If anyone could help, it was her. The phone rang twice before she picked up. "Jack, what's going on?" Elaine's voice was clear and steady, but Jack could tell she was already on edge. "I've got a situation," Jack said, keeping his voice low. "It's urgent. I need you to trust me." "I'm listening." Jack explained everything: the crash, the princess, and the alien warship. It felt strange, talking about something so unbelievable, but Elaine didn't interrupt. She listened, her silence telling him she was taking it all in. "Where are you?" Elaine asked when Jack finished. "About an hour outside of town," he replied. "I'll send you the coordinates. But listen, Elaine, this isn't just about protecting her. It's about humanity's future. I don't think the military can be trusted with this. We need to protect her from them too." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jack could feel the weight of his words hanging between them. Finally, Elaine spoke, her voice steady. "All right, Jack. We'll come. But we're not making any moves until we've got a plan. You'll need to be smart about this. Jack exhaled, feeling a little of the tension lift. Elaine was on his side. She'd always been someone who saw the bigger picture, who understood the importance of protecting what mattered. I'll keep the princess safe, Jack promised. I just need to buy us some time. They won't be here for another couple of hours, so we'll have some time to prepare. Understood. Just don't do anything reckless, Jack. I won't, Jack said, a small smile tugging at his lips. Trust me, I've got a few tricks left. He hung up, his mind already racing through possible plans. Elaine's team would be there soon, but he needed to act fast. If the alien warship didn't see them coming, they might have a chance to strike first, to disable it before it could land and bring chaos. Turning to the princess, Jack motioned for her to follow him. He led her outside to the makeshift outpost he had built years ago, a small structure with a few solar panels and a satellite dish. The desert stretched out in every direction, the vast emptiness of the land a reminder that they were alone. The princess stood silently beside him, her gaze once again fixed on the sky. Jack noticed she seemed to be watching the same star-like light he had seen earlier. It was growing brighter, signaling that the warship was closer than he thought. He didn't waste time. Jack grabbed his old survival pack, pulling out a few tools and some basic equipment. There wasn't much he could do to stop an advanced alien ship, but he could try to disable its communication systems, create a diversion, anything to delay the inevitable. We don't have much time, Jack muttered, more to himself than to the princess. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. Then she placed her hand on his arm, her touch surprisingly warm. It was a silent reassurance, a message that she believed in him. For the first time since she arrived, Jack saw a spark of hope in her eyes. "You can do this," he whispered, as much for himself as for her. As the alien ship loomed closer in the sky, Jack knew that the choices ahead would shape their future. And for the first time in a long while, Jack felt ready to face the unknown, no matter the cost. The hum of the alien craft was unmistakable now. The night sky, once calm and filled with stars, had been disturbed by the ship's approach. It wasn't just the noise that unnerved Jack. It was the feeling of being hunted. There was no mistaking it now. They weren't just here to find the princess. They were here to take her. Jack stood at the edge of his outpost, scanning the horizon with a pair of binoculars. The shape of the craft was still faint, but it was growing larger with every passing minute. His heart pounded in his chest. He had never been in a situation like this before. He had dealt with dangerous people, survived harsh conditions, but never something like this, an alien warship. The princess was inside, silent as ever. She had spent the last hour pacing the small room, her eyes fixed on the sky, as though she could sense every movement of the craft. Jack could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else there too. A deep sadness, a resignation. She had known this day was coming. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out and read the message from Elaine. "We're close. Hold tight. Stay low. Help is coming." Jack exhaled. He had no choice now but to trust Elaine and her team. He had warned her, and she had understood the gravity of the situation. She would get here in time. But how much time did they really have? The sound of the alien ship was louder now, a low hum that seemed to vibrate the very air around him. Jack turned to the princess, who had appeared at the doorway, her gaze still locked on the sky. "We don't have much time," Jack said, his voice tight with urgency. "They'll be here soon." She nodded, her lips pressed together in a thin line. She hadn't said much since their first meeting, but her actions spoke louder than words. She was strong, in ways Jack couldn't understand. She had survived the crash, and now she was prepared to face what was coming. Jack's thoughts raced. What should they do? The outpost wasn't strong enough to withstand a full assault from an alien warship, and there were no hidden places to escape to. If the military didn't arrive soon, they'd be left to face whatever was coming along. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The hum of the ship was now a deafening roar, and the air around them felt thick with the weight of its presence. Jack's heart skipped a beat as a bright light appeared in the sky, moving rapidly toward them. "They're here," he muttered. The princess stepped forward, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she held her ground, her stance firm, as if she had made peace with whatever was coming. Jack watched her, unsure of what to do. He couldn't leave her. Not now. The light grew brighter, and Jack could make out the shape of the ship, a large, dark vessel with sharp edges and an ominous glow. It hovered in the air, its engines glowing like embers, casting a faint, eerie light across the desert. Jack's breath caught in his throat. They were surrounded. "Listen to me," he said, grabbing the princess's arm gently. "We need to move. If we can't hide, we need to make sure we can at least slow them down." She didn't respond, but Jack could see that she understood. Together, they turned and hurried toward the small shelter behind the outpost, a place where they could quickly grab some supplies. Jack's mind raced with plans, anything that might give them a fighting chance. He needed to outsmart them. He needed to buy more time. Inside, Jack pulled open a cabinet and started grabbing everything he could. Basic tools, some makeshift explosives, and anything that could cause a distraction. The princess watched him, her eyes filled with a quiet intensity. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She knew this fight wasn't just about her. It was about their survival. Suddenly, a loud bang shook the air, and the ground beneath them trembled again. Jack glanced out the window. The alien ship had lowered itself to the desert floor, sending a gust of wind that kicked up the sand around them. The princess's face tightened, her hands clenching into fists. Jack could see the power in her, a force that was far beyond what he had imagined. She wasn't just a helpless alien. She was someone who had survived war, who had witnessed destruction on a scale Jack couldn't fathom. And now, she was about to face the consequences of her past. "Stay here," Jack said, his voice firm. "I'm going to try to slow them down. When the time comes, I need you to run. Don't wait for me. Get as far away as you can." She didn't respond, but Jack could see the reluctance in her eyes. She didn't want to leave him. But she knew as well as he did that their survival depended on their choices, and right now his plan was their only hope. Jack grabbed a small device from his pack, a signal jammer he had picked up years ago. It was a simple tool, but it could interfere with the warship's communications. If he could get close enough, it might create enough of a disruption to buy them time. He turned back to the princess. "Stay low. I'll be back as soon as I can." She nodded, her gaze never leaving him. For a moment, Jack saw something else in her eyes. Trust. He didn't have much time. The ship was already descending, and the noise of its engines was deafening now. Jack moved quickly, slipping out the back of the shelter and into the desert, his heart racing. The fight was just beginning, but Jack was determined to face it, no matter the cost. The sand under Jack's feet felt warm as he ran through the desert, his footsteps leaving brief, fading impressions in the earth. The alien craft loomed above him now, its massive shape casting a long shadow across the landscape. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, vibrating with the power of the ship's descent. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. His mind raced through his plan, getting close enough to the warship to use the signal jammer. He didn't know what kind of technology the ship had, but if he could disrupt its communications even for a few minutes, it could give them the upper hand. But even as he ran, Jack knew the risks. If he got too close, there was no guarantee he'd get back out alive. The ship's weapons systems could tear through him in seconds. And yet, despite the fear that gnawed at him, Jack couldn't turn back. The princess was depending on him. As he neared the edge of the ship's landing zone, Jack crouched low behind a rocky outcrop, his breath coming fast and shallow. The warship was now just a few hundred feet away, its engines humming loudly, causing the ground to tremble beneath him. A bright light blazed from the craft, casting an eerie glow across the desert. Jack could see movement now, figures emerging from the open hatch at the bottom of the ship. They were the alien soldiers, the ones who had come for the princess. Jack's grip tightened around the jammer in his hand. He had to move now, or all would be lost. He slipped from his hiding spot, keeping low to the ground as he made his way toward the ship. The distance between them seemed to stretch endlessly, but Jack forced himself to focus. Every step brought him closer. When he was within 20 feet of the warship, he stopped, his pulse racing. The aliens were closer now, scanning the ground, their dark shapes standing out against the bright light. They hadn't spotted him yet, but it was only a matter of time. Taking a deep breath, Jack pressed the button on the signal jammer. It hummed softly in his hand, and for a moment, nothing seemed to change. Then, the light on the ship flickered, and a strange static noise filled the air. Jack's heart surged with hope. It worked. He didn't wait to see the effect. Jack darted forward, keeping his movements swift and precise. He needed to get close to the craft's lower engine, where the signal jammer's interference would have the greatest impact. The alien soldiers were now looking around, scanning the area. Jack was sure they could sense something was wrong, but they still hadn't identified him. With the jammer in place, Jack ducked behind another rock, breathing hard. He knew this wouldn't be enough to stop them forever, but it might buy him a few precious minutes. He turned his head back toward the shelter, where the princess was waiting. But as he glanced toward the desert, a wave of panic washed over him. The princess wasn't there. She had gone. Jack's stomach twisted. She couldn't have left. He had told her to stay hidden, to wait for help, but something had changed. Something inside him told him that she had made the choice to act, to fight for her survival in her own way. His thoughts were interrupted by a loud screech, the sound of metal scraping against rock. Jack whipped his head back around to the ship. One of the alien soldiers had spotted him. "Run!" Jack shouted, his voice desperate. He didn't wait for the soldiers to respond. He was already sprinting back toward the shelter, his legs moving as fast as they could carry him. The sand beneath him shifted, and the wind howled around him, but he kept running. When Jack reached the shelter, he saw her, standing there, in the doorway, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. The princess had returned. "You shouldn't have come back," Jack said, panting. "I told you to stay hidden." She shook her head, her face calm but resolute. She didn't speak, but the meaning was clear. She had made her choice. Suddenly, a series of sharp, bright flashes lit up the night sky. The alien soldiers had begun their attack, their weapons firing into the air. Jack's heart sank as he realized that the fight had already begun. "They're here," the princess said in a low voice, finally breaking her silence. Jack turned back toward the warship. The soldiers were moving toward the shelter now, their weapons aimed at the ground. He could see their advanced technology, sleek armor that reflected the desert's light, strange weapons that hummed with energy. They were closing in fast. "We can't fight them head-on," Jack said, his mind racing for options. "We need to distract them, lead them away from here." The princess stepped forward, her eyes narrowed in concentration. She didn't speak, but Jack felt the weight of her presence. She wasn't just any alien. She was a survivor, a fighter. And he had to trust her now. As the soldiers grew closer, the princess raised her hand. Her fingers moved in a quick, precise motion, and suddenly, a bright light flashed from her body. It wasn't just a light. It was energy, a force so powerful that it sent a shockwave through the ground. The soldiers were thrown off balance, stumbling backward in surprise. Jack stared in awe as the princess stepped forward, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly power. She had more strength than he had ever imagined. "Go," she whispered, her voice carrying a new, commanding tone. Jack didn't need any more encouragement. He grabbed the jammer and dashed toward the warship, weaving between rocks and debris, using the cover to get closer. The alien soldiers were distracted, but for how long? He had to make it count. The fight was on, and Jack wasn't going to back down. Jack moved quickly, the ground beneath him shifting with each step as he sprinted toward the warship. The sound of the alien soldiers' voices echoed in the distance, but they were still disoriented by the princess's sudden burst of power. He had to make use of that moment. Every second counted. His heart raced, adrenaline flooding his veins as he ducked behind rocks, keeping low to avoid detection. He could still feel the heat from the alien craft in the air, the vibrations of its engines beneath his feet. The ship was powerful, too powerful to face head-on. But Jack wasn't trying to fight it. He was trying to survive. The princess had done her part. Now it was Jack's turn to finish what he had started. If he could just get to the ship's communication array and jam its signal completely, it might delay the soldiers enough for Elaine's team to arrive. The warship loomed before him, its surface gleaming in the dim light of the desert night. Jack took a deep breath, then carefully approached the base of the ship, staying hidden in the shadows. The alien soldiers were still recovering from the princess's energy blast, but they were regrouping quickly. Jack had only a few minutes before they regained full control. He reached the base of the ship and quickly found the access panel he had seen earlier. His fingers moved with practiced speed as he connected the signal jammer to the ship's communication system. The device hummed softly, and Jack hoped against hope that it would be enough. For a moment, nothing happened. The ship's engines hummed louder, and Jack felt the ground tremble once again. Then, with a sharp crackle, the lights on the warship flickered. The signal jammer had worked. He didn't wait to see the effects. Jack pulled himself back behind cover, his eyes scanning the battlefield. The alien soldiers were starting to regroup, their weapons raised, searching the area for any signs of movement. Jack knew it wouldn't be long before they realized the jammer was interfering with their communications. He had to act fast. Turning back toward the shelter, Jack signaled to the princess. She had been watching from a distance, her eyes sharp, her every movement calculated. She seemed to understand what Jack was thinking, and without a word, she began moving toward him. The ground beneath them shook again, but this time, it wasn't the warship. It was the sound of distant engines. Elaine's team had arrived. Jack could feel the relief washing over him as the familiar sound of military vehicles reached his ears. But the aliens weren't going down without a fight. The soldiers were starting to advance toward the shelter, their movements swift and efficient. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he realized they were preparing to launch an attack. The military vehicles wouldn't be able to stop them, not unless they could disable the warship. "Stay behind me," Jack whispered to the princess. She nodded, stepping back into the shelter as Jack took a deep breath and sprinted toward the approaching alien soldiers. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't trained to fight. But he had to do something. He had to give Elaine's team a chance. He reached a small pile of rocks near the shelter's entrance, crouching behind it as the aliens advanced. They were close now, and Jack could see the intricate details of their armor, the way their weapons hummed with energy. For a moment, the soldiers hesitated, their eyes scanning the area for Jack's position. He could feel his pulse in his throat, but he didn't move. He had to wait for the right moment. Then, with a sudden movement, one of the soldiers raised its weapon. Jack's instincts kicked in. He didn't think, he acted. With all the strength he could muster, he lunged from his hiding spot, grabbing a loose piece of metal from the ground and swinging it toward the soldier's weapon. The alien soldier recoiled, momentarily stunned, but it didn't take long for it to recover. Jack knew he couldn't defeat them head-on, but he could at least buy time. He threw himself at the alien, pushing it back into the sand. The soldier stumbled, disoriented, and Jack took the opportunity to grab its weapon. He didn't know how to use it, but he wasn't planning on using it for long. He raised the weapon into the air, hoping the shock and confusion would be enough to cause a delay. The alien soldiers hesitated, unsure of what was happening. It was just enough time for Jack to sprint back toward the shelter. He didn't have time to think. The soldiers were closing in, but Jack had seen the first signs of Elaine's team. Military vehicles racing toward the scene, their headlights shining bright. "Hold on," Jack shouted. "Help's here." The princess stepped out from behind the shelter, her eyes scanning the advancing aliens. Without hesitation, she raised her hand, and another wave of energy surged through the air. This time, the shockwave was stronger, more intense. The alien soldiers were knocked back, some of them losing their balance and falling to the sand. Jack felt a surge of hope. The aliens were vulnerable now, distracted, off balance. He knew Elaine's team would take advantage of this moment. A moment later, the military vehicle screeched to a halt near the shelter, and soldiers flooded out, weapons raised. Jack's heart surged as the tide began to turn. The soldiers from Earth were no longer just a backup. They were part of the fight. But the warship was still a threat. Jack knew the battle wasn't over. Not yet. The alien soldiers, though weakened, regrouped quickly, preparing for another assault. But now, they weren't facing just Jack and the princess. They were facing the united force. The war was on, and humanity was finally standing its ground. The battlefield was a blur of movement. The alien soldiers, though thrown off balance by the combined force of Jack and the princess's powers, were not backing down. Their sharp metallic armor gleamed in the desert light, and their weapons hummed with deadly energy. The military vehicles had arrived, but the aliens were regrouping quickly. It wasn't enough. Not yet. Jack stood at the edge of the shelter, his pulse racing as the soldiers prepared for another attack. Elaine's team was spread out, taking cover behind rocks and sand dunes. They were skilled, but they weren't prepared to face an alien army alone. The princess, standing beside Jack, glanced at him with a determined look in her eyes. She had already used her energy to protect them once, but the force it took to create those shockwaves was draining. Jack could see the faintest signs of exhaustion on her face. She was still powerful, but she was human in many ways. "We need to end this," Jack said, his voice low but firm. "We need to get to the warship. If we take it down, the soldiers will retreat." The princess nodded, her face hardening. She didn't speak, but her body language was clear. She was ready. They both were. Jack looked toward Elaine, who had taken position behind the cover of a military jeep, barking orders to her soldiers. They were already moving into position, and Jack knew they wouldn't be able to hold the aliens back for much longer. The warship was still hovering above them, its dark form casting a shadow over the landscape. "We'll go for the warship," Jack said, turning back to the princess. "Stay close to me." She nodded again, her expression unreadable. The two of them sprinted toward the alien ship, moving quickly through the sand, keeping low to avoid being seen. The soldiers were distracted, engaged with the human military forces, but Jack knew that wouldn't last for long. The warship had powerful weapons, and if the aliens realized their ship was vulnerable, they'd turn their focus on the humans. As they got closer to the warship, Jack could feel the energy in the air intensifying. The ship's engines hummed louder, the sound growing almost deafening. The ground seemed to tremble with each movement. The closer they got, the more the air seemed to buzz with an otherworldly presence. Then they were there. Standing just outside the ship's massive entrance, Jack glanced at the princess. She was calm, poised, ready. They had one shot. Suddenly, the hatch of the warship opened with a loud hiss. Alien soldiers poured out, their weapons raised, scanning for any threat. Jack barely had time to react as the first soldier spotted them. The alien's eyes locked on Jack, and for a brief moment, Jack felt the weight of its gaze. Cold, calculating. Without thinking, he pushed the princess behind him and raised his own weapon, aiming for the approaching soldier. The alien's weapon hummed to life, but Jack fired first. The blast from his weapon sent the soldier stumbling back, but it didn't take long for more to emerge. The princess, sensing the danger, stepped forward, her hands raised. Her energy flowed from her fingertips, and in an instant, a brilliant burst of light shot out, hitting one of the alien soldiers directly. It fell to the ground, unable to recover. Jack couldn't help but stare at the raw power she wielded. He had seen her fight, But this was something more. This was a force of nature. But they couldn't stop here. "Move," Jack shouted, pulling the princess with him as they darted toward the ship's entrance. The soldiers were recovering, but Jack could see the panic in their movements. They weren't expecting a fight like this. They reached the door, and with a quick glance at the princess, Jack hit the release button. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing the dark interior of the warship. Without a second thought, they both rushed inside. The interior was cold, metal walls lined with strange symbols and glowing lights. The air smelled sterile, almost like something artificial. The ship was silent, except for the faint hum of its engines. Jack didn't have time to take in the details. They had to find the control room, and fast. They moved quickly through the narrow corridors, Jack leading the way, his eyes darting back and forth. The princess was right behind him, her presence a reassuring strength at his side. They passed rooms filled with alien technology, strange devices that Jack couldn't begin to understand. Finally, they'd reached the heart of the warship, the control room. Inside, alien officers were at their stations, monitoring the battle outside. The moment they saw Jack and the princess, they'd reached for their weapons. But it was too late. With a burst of energy from the princess, the officers were thrown against the walls, their weapons clattering to the ground. Jack moved quickly, grabbing the nearest control panel and smashing it with the weapon he had taken from the soldiers. Sparks flew as the system shorted out. It wasn't enough to destroy the ship, but it was enough to disable its primary systems. The warship began to shudder, and Jack could hear the alarms blaring in the distance. "Now," he shouted to the princess. The princess raised her hands once more, and this time, the energy she unleashed was more intense than ever. A blast of light shot out, hitting the central core of the ship. There was a sudden, deafening noise, followed by a deep rumble that shook the entire structure. The warship was losing power. Jack grabbed the princess's arm. "We need to get out, now." Together, they sprinted toward the exit, just as the ship began to collapse in on itself. The doors slammed shut behind them as they ran, and the sound of the explosions echoed through the corridors. They burst out into the desert, where the military vehicles were still engaged in combat with the alien soldiers. But as the warship's systems failed, the remaining aliens began to retreat. Their morale shattered. They scattered into the desert. Jack looked up at the sky as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. The battle was over. The princess stood beside him, her chest rising and falling with each breath. She was exhausted, but there was a sense of quiet victory in her eyes. She had fought for her survival. And now, with the warship disabled and the alien forces retreating, humanity had won. They had won, together. And as the sun rose higher, Jack knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where the bonds between humanity and the stars would grow stronger. A chapter where the future, though uncertain, was filled with hope. The princess smiled faintly. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to tell Jack that, despite everything they had faced, they had both found something worth fighting for. And perhaps in this vast, uncharted galaxy, they weren't so alone after all.